threatening me with a cat. No good. No good.
Hello everyone, welcome to Phoenixville Public Library, either those on Zoom or in the room. And we're pleased to have with us tonight Dr. Paul Kahan, a leading expert on U.S. political, economic, and diplomatic history, who has his doctorate in U.S. history from Temple University. He's published a couple of books, including Eastern State Penitentiary, A History, and Amiable Scoundrel, Simon Cameron, Lincoln's Scandalous Secretary of War. His latest book, though, is Philadelphia, A Narrative History, and here to tell us all about that book and more, we welcome Paul Kahan.
Thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate it. Thank you. It's very kind of you. I'll tell you, that description makes me sound awful at cocktail parties, and I totally am. Which brings me to a discussion that I was having last night when I mentioned to my daughters, who are 8 and 11, both going on 16, but in different ways, that I would not be home for dinner because I'd be doing this. And they were like, they cannot believe that people pay money to hear me speak, because they get to hear me speak for free and they think they're overpaying. So there was a big long discussion at dinner where my youngest daughter actually was like, the book is not that interesting, what is wrong with people? And my older daughter was like, yes. She was like, you gotta soften the crowd up with some jokes, because you're gonna lose them once you start talking. I guess they're doing like a public speaking thing in her class. So she's like, I was like, well, I don't know any jokes. She was like, I've got you covered. Would you like to hear my daughter's jokes?
Yeah.
All right, it is the high point of the evening. After I'm done with the jokes, you can get up and leave and feel like you're missing nothing. Joke number 1. Why do fish swim in salt water? Because pepper water makes them sneeze. Now, I've got an old chestnut. My daughter told my mother this joke weeks ago, and my mother's still trying to puzzle it out. Are you ready? What do you do when you see a spaceman?
Parking it, man.
You park your car, man! Yes! Very good. Yeah, it's a thinker. It'll get back to you in like 2 hours. You'll be sitting at home and be like, oh, that's what that meant. So as Mark said, my name is Paul Kahan. I am a historian specializing in the history of the United States. And I'm here tonight to talk about my 7th book, Philadelphia, A Narrative History, which was published on October 29th by the University of Pennsylvania Press. And I am delighted that the Phoenixville Library saw fit to bring me out tonight. Now, before we get started about the actual history of Philadelphia, I think it's important to talk a little bit about the book and why I wrote it. The last single-volume comprehensive history of the city of Philadelphia was published in 1982 for the 300th anniversary of the city's founding. I was born in 1980, so that book reflects almost none of my lived experience. So that was one issue. The second issue is it was published at a particularly dark period in the city's history. I don't know if you remember the late 70s or the early 80s. It was not a high point of urban living, and we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. And I think more importantly, that book, which is a great book, it's well worth your time after you've bought and digested my book, is a compilation of different historians writing different chapters. So chapter 1 is one historian, chapter 2 is another historian, and so it's very uneven in terms of focus and in flow and all sorts of things. And I wanted something that was a little bit more consistent across topics. But I think the most important issue is that I have spent most of my career in museums, and that has shaped...
Point it at the laptop.
Perfect. How I look at the past. So a little bit about me. Proud Temple University graduate. I earned my PhD there in 2009. Go Owls. In 2008, I published my first book, Eastern State Penitentiary, A History, and I now live in Ardmore with my delightful, if spirited children and my long-suffering wife. The Eastern State Penitentiary book is an interesting book. It grew out of my experience working at the museum as a tour guide. And I have spent most of my career in museums. Eastern State Penitentiary, Fonthill, the home of Henry Chapman Mercer in Doylestown, the William Britton Seventeen04 House in Westchester, the Daniel Boone Homestead. I've worked in museums. I've worked with physical stuff, interpreting it, telling the story of the past through stuff, through things, through places. And that very much shaped my approach to writing about Philadelphia. And my goal for the book is that after you have read it, is that you go out into the spaces that I talk about and you experience them for yourself. That I write about the place where the gun that was used to assassinate Abraham Lincoln was manufactured in Philadelphia. Go see it, right? I write about the Stetson factory, which it was literally where the iconic cowboy hat was manufactured. You can go see the remnants of it. I mean, Philadelphia is a place and you can experience those things. And my goal for the book was to root it very heavily in space, in places, and to begin a conversation about those places. And of course, it is a narrative history, so it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. God help us. But I start the book with a really interesting anecdote that is based on an observation. Having spent my entire career working in museums, I want to give you my impression of history as it is, of Philadelphia as it is taught, and it is this. Philadelphia does a miserable job remembering its own history. And I know that sounds counterintuitive. You're looking at me slyly. I'm going to prove it to you, I hope. Because you're thinking, my God, you cannot swing a dead cat in Center City without hitting something of historical importance. A building, an artifact, a costumed reenactor. And I know this because I have swung several dead cats in Center City, and I have always hit something of historical value. In fact, the police have asked me to stop coming into the city with dead cats, which I think is really ungenerous of them. But let me give you an anecdote that I think illustrates this. Anyone know what that building is?
Museum of the American Revolution.
That is the Museum of the American Revolution. Thank you very much. Apparently we have a ringer here in the room. That is the Museum of the American Revolution. That museum opened in 2017. It cost nearly $200 million to build that building, populate it with artifacts and exhibits, and do all of the stuff that goes into making a museum work. And every dollar of that $200 million is on display. Has anyone been to the Museum of the American Revolution? It is a fantastic museum. It is not a good museum, it is a great museum. I like to describe it as a chocolate cake of a museum. Dense, rich, overwhelming. Like, I don't think you could do that museum in a single visit and feel like you have seen everything. It definitely requires multiple visits. And so, as I say, every dollar of that nearly $200 million is visible when you go see it. Fantastic exhibits, well thought out, well written, well crafted. They have the tent that George Washington slept in for most of the war. I mean, it's a really incredible space. I can't say enough good things about it. And it has quickly established itself as one of the premier museums, not just in Philadelphia, but in the United States. Well worth your time. Anyone know what that building is?
Bank.
It was, no, actually it is not a bank, although it very much looks like a bank. Banks tend to be neoclassical architecture, and that is neoclassical architecture. It opened in 1824 as the first home of the Franklin Institute, but it exists today, and since 1938 it's been the Atwater Kent Museum. In 2010 it was rebranded as the Museum of the City of Philadelphia. And in 2018, it closed its doors for want of funding because City Council, which is legally obligated to fund the museum, was like, nah, we're out. So for want of a few $100,000, the Museum of the City of Philadelphia closed its doors. Whereas less than a year earlier, a $200 million museum celebrating the American Revolution opened its doors. Not a single one of those dollars made their way to there. And I think this gives you a sense of the central premise of the book. We remember the hell out of the American Revolution, right? When we talk about the history of the city of Philadelphia, you're thinking very much the history from 1750 to about 1800, the history of the American Revolution. And I think if I gave you a quiz on the American Revolution, just by osmosis, you've picked up enough to pass. But if I ask you anything before 1750 or anything after 1800, I think you would struggle. And the reason that you would struggle is because we do a terrible job with everything else, with the vast majority of the city's history. And that, I think, is an incredibly important observation, and the book is an attempt to remedy that by talking, yes, about the American Revolution, but also talking about all of this other stuff and making it comprehensible and accessible to the general public. I don't know if I've done that, but that was certainly the goal. Now, the book is built around 5 themes that I think recur throughout the history of the city of Philadelphia. The first of these is diversity. Diversity has always been a core characteristic of Philadelphia. Even before Philadelphia's founder, William Penn, arrived in the region in 1682, the Delaware Valley was home to a diverse mix of Native Americans, Africans, Dutch, English, Finns, and Swedes. And that's incredibly important. Europeans had been in the Delaware Valley for more than a half century before William Penn founded the colony of Pennsylvania. And they created a lot of the muscle memory that made it possible to live in grudging, and I want to emphasize that, reluctant tolerance of one another, but nevertheless tolerance of one another. And so when Penn comes and founds a colony that is based explicitly on religious toleration and implicitly ethnic toleration, he was building on muscle memory and precedents created by Europeans and Native Americans who had been in this area for more than a half century before he got here. Does that make sense? All right. So diversity is a clear characteristic, and it grows over the period of the city's existence. Penn's famed religious tolerance encouraged immigration to Pennsylvania and swelled the colony's population, which by the end of the 18th century included French, German, Irish, Scots, and Welsh. During the 19th century, Russians, Italians, Poles, and Chinese settled in the region, followed by Dominicans, Haitians, Indians, Jamaicans, Koreans, Puerto Ricans, and Vietnamese, to name just a few, in the 20th century. And in fact, cities in general are the most ethnically, racially, religiously, etc., diverse places in the United States. Now, that diversity has often fueled conflict. And conflict has been a second persistent theme in the history of Philadelphia. Despite the city's tagline as the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia has frequently failed to live up to that idea and has been racked by religious, ethnic, racial, political conflict. I write in the book, individual and institutionalized racism, xenophobia, homophobia, and religious intolerance have left an indelible mark on the city politically, geographically, and economically. Throughout its history, the city of brotherly love has frequently failed to live up to its nickname. So you can almost think of those two as existing in tension with one another. Third theme is American anti-urbanism. And I have bad news for you. Americans hate cities. And it is like a core part of our DNA that we hate cities. I note in the book that anti-urbanism has deep and pernicious roots in U.S. culture. George Washington once asserted, "The tumultuous populace of large cities are ever to be dreaded," while Thomas Jefferson, writing to Philadelphian Benjamin Rush in 1800, called cities pestilential to the morals, the health, and the liberties of man. As my daughter Zoe would say, sick burn. If she were here, she would turn purple and blink out of existence from embarrassment. I'm glad that you're filming this so that I can show it to her later. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, whose New Deal in the 1930s helped forge a powerful political coalition that includes large swaths of urban workers, nevertheless, in the words of one aide, always did and always would think people better off in the country and would regard cities as rather hopeless. Anti-urbanism helps explain why cities like Philadelphia are nearly constant targets of reform. And emerging from a period of political campaigning, which just ended a few weeks ago, ask yourself this question. Do we ever talk about reforming rural America? Do politicians ever talk about rural reform? We got to get out to the farm and teach those farmers moral values. We got to teach them, we got to reform their schools and all that stuff. Do you ever hear that? No. Do they ever talk about suburban reform? Got to get out on the main line, teach those mainliners how to read, deal with their falling test scores. And you're laughing because it's so goddamn ridiculous, isn't it? No one has ever said that. When we talk about reform, what do we talk about reforming? Cities. They are the only places that we target for reform, right? Because we hate cities. We want to make them, we don't really want to make them more like rural America, right? We want to make them like suburban America. That's really the holy of holies. But think about it, right? We have a great pop star, John Cougar Mellencamp, writes all these songs about rural America. I grew up in a small town, right? You've all heard of John Cougar Mellencamp, I presume. Blood on the Plow, all that stuff. Who is the great songwriter of urban America? I'll tell you who, rap artists. And do we not have a lot of antipathy toward rap artists? I grew up in the 90s. I was there when white school administrators were saying uber racist things about rappers. Remember that? Well, we only think of cities as targets of reform, and that is, I think, a large portion of our persistent anti-urbanism. All right, theme number 4, space. While we tend to take Philadelphia's location and even its existence for granted, the city did not simply appear. It was planned, planted, and cultivated. Philadelphia has always been a place where carefully curated spaces and structures, buildings, public art, etc., were intended to foster specific values and encourage citizens to behave in quote-unquote virtuous ways. The faith in the power of buildings, space, and public art to influence citizens' behavior spans Philadelphia's history and is visible in William Penn's plan for the city, John Haviland's design for Eastern State Penitentiary, Jacques Greber's outline of what is now called the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, and Edmund Bacon's ambitious urban renewal program in Society Hill. And that is a particularly interesting element of Philadelphia's history because space is so heavily tied to the evolution of Philadelphia. When we think of Philadelphia, we think of streets that align at 90-degree angles, right? Numbers go north and south, trees go east and west. Remember that? That's what we think of as Philadelphia. I mean, Philadelphia is not the only grid city, but it is probably the best known grid city, at least in the United States. And then, of course, the issue of memory, which is something we've already discussed. Memory is distinct from history. Memory is what we remember about the past. And as I've argued, we have a very, very selective memory about Philadelphia's history. We choose a very small segment of that history, in part because we can monetize it through tourism, and for a variety of other reasons. I mean, it has certain political overtones that we like a whole lot. And we tell a very uncomplicated story about it. All right, so those are the themes of the book. Are you ready to begin a whirlwind history of the city of Philadelphia?
Yeah.
Perfect, then let's go. At the site of modern-day Philadelphia live several bands of Native Americans collectively known as the Lenape, or Original Man. The Lenape were semi-nomadic foragers and fishers who lived near what we now call the Delaware River in a roughly triangular-shaped territory that stretched from present-day Delaware's Cape Henlopen north to what is now Trenton, New Jersey, and west to the Schuylkill River's edge. This map, by the way, is a little misleading because it implies that the Lenape lived in this entire area. They did, but only seasonally. When the first Europeans arrived in the 17th century, there were a few hundred, maybe 2,000 Lenni Lenape living in this area. It was heavily wooded, and they lived in small bands, normally about 2 dozen, but they migrated, right? They spent some part of the year along the river, they spent some part of the year in the woods, and they were semi-nomadic. So they would come to an area a couple of times over several years, and then they would leave and move on. And they would bump into one another, and there were some trading links. But by and large, this was uninhabited land. It was wilderness, and it was heavily, heavily forested. And if you've ever walked through a state park, or you've ever walked through something like Fairmount Park, you get a sense of how heavily wooded this was. I mean, not for nothing did Penn name this Pennsylvania. Penn's Woods. I mean, it was a very heavily wooded area. Nevertheless, the Lenni Lenape were here and had been here since prehistoric times. The earliest white settlers in the region were the Dutch. And in 1609, Henry Hudson sailed into the Delaware Bay aboard the Holiday Moon. Now, initially, the Dutch were traders, right? They were here to get beaver pelts. They would get the beaver pelts, they'd put them on the ships, and they would take them back to Europe. They were not interested in permanent settlement. This is not New England, where you have a bunch of religious fanatics who can't get along with anyone. I'm sorry, did I say that? Religious fanatics who couldn't get along with anyone else, moving to get away from everyone else. That was not what was going on here. They were coming here to reap natural resources and then take them back, which kept their numbers relatively small and kept their settlement footprint incredibly small, which as a result, you had much less conflict with the Native Americans. There's a lot more conflict in New England and to a certain extent in what we now call Virginia, because it was clear those people were here to stay, and they were going to have families, and they were going to grow, and they were going to just keep expanding. The Delaware Valley story is a little bit different. Now the Dutch are the first Europeans to get here, but it's really the Swedes who begin settling in the 1630s who make this land their own. The Dutch end up in what is now Manhattan. They found a colony called New Netherland. The Swedes down here found New Sweden. And they too are interested in resource extraction. In 1638, Peter Minuit established the New World's first Swedish colony, New Sweden, on the Delaware Peninsula for his employer, the Swedish South Company. So, they're really interested in resource extraction, but there is going to be a more or less permanent footprint. Again, very small numbers, which keeps the amount of conflict with the Native Americans at a relatively low ebb. Now, sidebar, anyone know what this is? It is some kind of flag, but it's not a randomly selected flag. Philadelphia's flag. Philadelphia adopted the first municipal flag in the United States in 1887. Every time you walk into a municipal building in Philadelphia, you're walking by this flag. Anyone know why it's that color? Exactly! It is a memorial to the fact that the Swedes ran, where Philadelphia was New Sweden for 30 years before being taken over by the English. And yet, how many of you before tonight were aware of the long shadow of Swedish immigration and political control of the Delaware Valley? No, we don't tell that story. We tell the story that begins with William Penn, right? So, to a certain extent, even though you walk by this all the time when you go into Philadelphia, it's been largely memory hold, right? We don't talk about that. By the way, fantastic museum of Swedish history in Philadelphia in FDR Park. And I would highly recommend that you buy the book, read the book, and then go down to FDR Park and check it out because it's well worth your time. But make sure you buy the book first. In 1664, the English take over New Netherlands. They rename it New York. By that point, the Dutch had taken over control of New Sweden. So with New Netherlands, the English took control of the Delaware Valley. And that is how the English crown controlled what is now Pennsylvania and was in a position to give it to this guy. Now, I always feel like William Penn, oh no, this doesn't work on the screen.
No, it doesn't.
I always feel like William Penn looks like the Quaker Oats guy, which breaks my heart, because he was a good-looking dude when he was young, right? Like, he was a good-looking guy. And this is how we remember him, is everyone's like Pillsbury Doughboy grandfather. Like, it breaks my heart. Anyway, so I put some pictures of William Penn up there, mostly because, of course, William Penn casts a very long shadow over the city. We really think Philadelphia's history starts with him. Penn is granted what is now called Pennsylvania by the English crown in payment of a debt that was owed to his father, who was also named William Penn. William Penn Sr. had been on both sides of the English Civil War. He ends up on the winning side, which is how the crown was like, all right, we owe you money. And so when William Penn was like, hey, how about some of that really awesome land in the New World in lieu of actual money, the crown was only too happy to give it to him. And this is the colony of Pennsylvania. Now, this teeny tiny little piece up here is the city of Philadelphia. And I put it there to show you the scale of what William Penn was given. Penn always intended for there to be a city of Philadelphia because he always intended shipping for Philadelphia to be a mercantile capital. And the plan was that all of the bounty of this agricultural land would come down here, get put on ships, down the Delaware, out into the Atlantic. So that was the plan. Now, Penn, of course, religious tolerance, Quaker, all that stuff. We've heard that story before, right? All of that is true. But there was also an economic imperative in religious tolerance, because Penn was going to rule Pennsylvania like a feudal lord. By which I meant he was going to sell some of the land, he was going to rent other parts of it, and people were going to owe him a portion of the produce or money as if he were a medieval lord. That was the plan. This was a money-making operation. And religious tolerance served that goal by encouraging people to come, right? If you weren't Puritan, you were not welcome in New England. They made that abundantly clear every chance they had. Whereas, you could come to Pennsylvania, and it's good land, and you clear it, and you make a lot of money, and it'll be great. And as a matter of fact, Penn wanted to sell 5,000-acre tracts of land and incentivize people to buy them by giving them lots in the city of Philadelphia. Early settlement in Philadelphia was actually a reward for buying these big chunks of land, and then of course those parcels of land would be subdivided, sold, rented, etc. But the whole thing was an economic transaction as much as it was a statement of principle. And one of the most important elements of the city of Philadelphia was the layout. Now this is based on a map that Penn's surveyor Thomas Holm created for the city. And Penn had very definite ideas about how people should live. Depending on the size of the tract of land that you bought on that last map, that would dictate the size of the parcel you got in Philadelphia, as well as its location. And proximity to the Delaware River was the most valuable piece of land, because of course this was going to be a shipping hub, so you wanted to be close to the docks. If you were running a business, or you had a house, you did any of that stuff, you wanted to be as close to the water as possible. That was going to be the most valuable. And Penn had this vision for how people would live. He had hoped to create a green country town, which is why you've got public squares, and the lots are super regular, and almost immediately people got a hold of their lots and did exactly the opposite of what Penn wanted them to do. They subdivided them, they built businesses on them, they tried to cram as much as possible onto it, and Penn was like, "This is not what I wanted you to do!" And they were like, "Private property, my man! We're going to do whatever we want to do." And so there was this constant low-key conflict between people living in Philadelphia and Penn for control over his vision. And not for nothing, Penn had a lot of frustrations with Pennsylvania. I detail them in the book. The colony basically swallows his fortune and makes him insane, because people are just not doing what he wants them to do. And this, of course, is a persistent tension. You've got elite city planners up here coming up with great ideas and running headlong into the reality that people are going to do what people are going to do. That once you have sold them a piece of land, they are going to live the way that they want to live, despite your best efforts. And that is a tension that use of space is going to come up time and time and time again, and it drives Penn insane. Now, Penn dies in 1718, and his fail sons try to make the colony pay. And it never quite works out that way. They actually end up converting to Anglicanism, and politics in the colony gets super weird. Like the Quakers in the Assembly sent Benjamin Franklin to London to argue to the Crown that the Crown should take back the Penn family charter. Because the Quakers think they'll have a better job under the Crown than they will under the Penn family. That's how weird things get. But one of the bigger issues is the fact that municipal government in Philadelphia during this period is pretty weak. That Philadelphians, you never really get a municipal government that meets the needs of its citizens. And as a result, you have people turning to voluntary organizations to fill the gap. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a sociologist at the University of Pennsylvania named E. Digby Baltzell. Anyone ever hear that name? Okay. A couple of people I see shaking their heads. He wrote 2 books on this issue. One is called Puritan Boston, Quaker Philadelphia. The other is called The Private City. And what he basically argues is the defining characteristic of Philadelphia in this period is privatism, by which he means turning to private organizations to meet public needs. And of course, Mr. Private Organization to fill public needs is Benjamin Franklin, right? I mean, he founds insurance companies and fire companies and the first subscription library in Philadelphia, mostly to meet his needs, also to make some money, but in general to make Philadelphia a better, more livable place. One of the most interesting aspects of the book is my discovery that one of the key ways in which the city made money was by fining people who refused to serve as mayor if they were elected. So they would elect a guy mayor, he'd be like, this job sucks, I refuse. And they'd be like, fine, we're going to fine you. And then they'd elect another guy and be like, this job sucks, I will rather pay the fine. And that became a significant source of revenue, which gives you a sense of the challenges that were presented to the city's government. And part of the reason why it was so challenging is because of Philadelphia's explosive growth. Philadelphia blows up. Pennsylvania is one of the last of the original 13 colonies founded. It's founded in 1681. By the time of the American Revolution, right? So by the 1770s, you're talking less than 100 years, Philadelphia has grown into the second largest city in the British Empire. Now let me say that again. Not the second largest city in North America. The second largest city in the British Empire. There's London and there is Philadelphia. And the colonies themselves are experiencing explosive growth. Franklin calculated on the back of an envelope that basically if they kept growing at the rate they were, there would be more British subjects living in North America than living in London. And he was not in England. And he was not shy about sharing that, which freaked people in London out because they could feel the political power shifting to the New World with that population. It's one of the reasons why after the French and Indian War, the Crown institutes the Proclamation of 1763 line, which was an attempt to keep Europeans on the east side of that line and prevent them from settling. It doesn't work, mostly because officials here refuse to enforce it. But Philadelphia is becoming the largest and most important city in what will become the United States. Is at this time the North American colonies. And it's ideally suited for revolutionary activity. It's kind of in the middle, right? And it's a mercantile capital. And the American Revolution is largely a merchant's revolution, right? The people who are mostly involved with it are city dwellers, particularly merchants, guys like John Hancock, whose smuggling business is threatened by the Tea Act. Fun fact about the Tea Act reduces the tax on tea. It actually makes tea cheaper. What they object to in reality is the fact that it raises the sanctions for smuggling. So it undercut what Hancock's ability to smuggle tea, and it made it more, it raised the criminal sanctions, which is why Hancock hated it. It wasn't some great, philosophical position about, the power of the monarchy or anything like that. So Philadelphia is playing this incredibly important role, and this is really Philadelphia's moment in the sun, right? This is the period about Philadelphia that we remember the most, that's 1750 to 1800. But even that, I would argue, we do a terrible job remembering. Did you know there was a Philadelphia Tea Party? Bet you didn't. But Philadelphians actually passed a resolution saying we will not allow to be unloaded any East India Company tea in rejection of the Tea Act. And that action, that resolution, inspired the Boston Tea Party. And a couple weeks later, when British East India ships showed up in Philadelphia, they prevented the tea from being unloaded. They didn't destroy it, which is how they were different from Boston. The Bostonians threw it into Boston Harbor. The Philadelphians just very politely, the last time Philadelphians were polite, said, you're putting it back on the ship and you're sailing away. And that's the reason the Crown shut down Boston Harbor but didn't sanction Philadelphia. But nevertheless, Philadelphia becomes home first to the Continental Congresses, then the Constitutional Convention, and then for 10 years the federal government. It's really the seat of political power. It's the federal government, it's the state government. I mean, the 1790s were Philadelphia's moment in the sun. And it's interesting because, how many of you have seen the musical Hamilton? Hamilton was clearly written by a New Yorker. Because it's all about how awesome New York is. I have bad news for you. New York sucked. Philadelphia was where things happened. You want to talk about where you could be a new man? When Franklin wanted to be a new man, where did he go? Did he go to New York? No. Closer to Boston, but he didn't go there. Where did he come? Philadelphia. When Burr is giving Hamilton a hard time about selling out New York, he's like, but we'll have the banks. Excuse me, where were the banks located? First Bank of the United States is not in Manhattan, it is in Philadelphia. The Second Bank of the United States, here in Philadelphia. That discussion took place here in Philadelphia. So yeah, Lin-Manuel Miranda tries to elide that, but the reality of the situation is Manhattan doesn't become Manhattan until the 19th century with the opening of the Erie Canal. That's what turns Manhattan into the economic center of the United States and shifts the geography of the country's economy to New York. But even after that happens, Philadelphia throughout the 19th century is referred to as the Athens of America. Think about that for a second. What does Athens connote? A center of democracy, a center of learning, the philosophical, the cultural capital. And that's what Philadelphia provides. Philadelphia was on the absolute bloody edge of cutting-edge technology, culture, architecture, all that stuff. People came from around the world to see Philadelphia. When Charles Dickens, noted novelist, came to North America in 1842, there were two things he wanted to see: Niagara Falls and Eastern State Penitentiary. How many of you have ever heard of Alexa de Tocqueville's little book, Democracy in America? Incredibly important study of the United States in the 1830s as it was embracing a more democratic form of government, generally referred to as Jacksonianism. De Tocqueville didn't come here because he cared about Jacksonianism or he cared about democracy. He was sent by the French government to look at Eastern State Penitentiary and see if that model of prisons could be adapted and used in France. These were cutting. This is the waterworks this one's in Center Square, opened in 1815. Pumped water through underground pipes throughout the city. Philadelphians had a technological standard of living that was in many ways the envy of the world, and certainly the focus of interest in the United States. When we talk about cultural capitals of the United States today, we think New York, we think Los Angeles, right? Those are the places where the books are manufactured, the magazines are published, the movies are made, the television. In the 19th century, it was Philadelphia. Most of you probably know that Edgar Allan Poe lived here in Philadelphia briefly and wrote many of his best-known short stories while he was here. Did you ever sit back and wonder, gee, why did Edgar Allan Poe, a Southerner, live here in Philadelphia? What sense does that make? You want to know the answer? He was an editor for a magazine. And if you were an editor for a magazine, guess where you were living? Here in Philadelphia, because that's where most of the best magazines were published. Mark Twain, prior to becoming Mark Twain, becoming a writer, lived briefly in Philadelphia, where he worked for what is now the Philadelphia Inquirer as essentially a typesetter. I mean, this was the cultural capital of the United States. Incredibly important place to be. Now, Philadelphia, I think we skipped it. Oh no. Okay. So, Philadelphia is an incredibly important cultural center. That makes it, of course, a center for the leading political issue of the 19th century, which is the conflict over human enslavement. And Philadelphia has a kind of interesting relationship to human enslavement. On the one hand, Pennsylvania was a leading center of abolitionist thought and action. The earliest published anti-slavery memorial, I guess you would call it, was in Germantown in 1688, the Germantown anti-slave petition. The first abolitionist law promulgated in the United States was adopted by the General Assembly of Pennsylvania in 1780, and the first abolitionist society was formed in Philadelphia in 1787 and counted among its early supporters Benjamin Franklin. Incredible abolitionist bona fides. And as a result, Philadelphia develops the largest free black population in north of the Mason-Dixon. I mean, it's a huge black population. All right, so we have this large free black population. We have this decades-long commitment to abolitionism, but while Philadelphia is also undoubtedly a northern city because it sits above the Mason-Dixon, which is the de facto line separating free and slave, it's got a very peculiar relationship. You can think of it as the southernmost northern city, but you can also think of it as the northernmost southern city because it has deep connections to the south. For instance, Philadelphia's economy was always diversified. Its manufacturing was always spread across a bunch of different things. It was not like Detroit, which made cars, and when that died, the entire city died. Philadelphia was never like that. But one of its leading industries was textiles, shirts, rugs, whatever. What is the thing that all of those things have in common?
Cotton.
Yup. And who was growing the cotton?
Down south.
Exactly. And it was enslaved people growing the cotton. So a threat to human enslavement was a threat to Philadelphia's textile industry. It was a threat to Philadelphia's insurance industry because Philadelphians were insuring that. It was a threat to the banking establishment. So there was a lot of Philadelphia's economy that was tied up in human enslavement. And as a matter of fact, there was a segment of Chestnut Street that was called Carolina Row for the number of mansions that South Carolinian enslavers owned here in the city. The largest auction of enslaved people happened in 1859 when Pierce Butler's forced labor camp was liquidated to pay his gambling debts. Guess where Pierce Butler's buried? He's buried here because a large portion of his life happened here in Philadelphia. So there was this very close connection to the South that made the politics of human enslavement fraught. In addition, even if you were anti-slave, that didn't mean that you weren't a racist. And there was plenty of racism here in the city, even among people who had no reason to be connected to the South. In 1838, abolitionists built Pennsylvania Hall. It was open for exactly 3 days before racists in the city burned it to the ground. Yeah, they were not playing. There were gangs with colorful names like the Killers, the Dead Rabbits, the Plug Uglies, who, just for fun, would start race pogroms. They'd go into a black neighborhood and basically start a pogrom. And there were horribly, horribly vicious pogroms in the 1830s and 1840s, race riots on a scale like you wouldn't believe. Fires, and they burned things down, and that wasn't the only violence. I mean, there was an anti-Catholic riot in July and August of 1844 that led to the burning down of several churches. But, again, there was a lot of urban disorder in this period. Anyone know the best-selling book of the 19th century before the Civil War? Yeah, go ahead. Uncle Tom's Cabin, absolutely. Most of you probably read at least a portion of it in high school, right? You're all familiar with it. When Harriet Beecher Stowe met Abraham Lincoln, he very condescendingly called her the little lady that started this big war. Perfect. Great. Anyone want to know the second best-selling novel in the United States prior to the Civil War? Now, I would never ask a question if I hadn't already given you the answer. The Killers! A narrative of real life in Philadelphia by George Lippard, which has the feel of a Law and Order episode. It's ripped from the headlines. It's a very thinly fictionalized account of the Killers, this Philadelphia gang, basically starting a race riot in Philadelphia. It was a runaway bestseller. People read it, people loved it, and guess what? None of you have ever heard of it. It's been totally memory hold. George Lippard wrote a bunch of books, famous in his day. Philadelphia, none of you have ever heard of him. So again, we memory all this stuff. We have absolutely no sense of how pernicious the racist conflict in the 19th century was, in the lead up to the Civil War. And this matters because it has an indelible impact on the city. Up to this point, this is Philadelphia, right? Vine Street, South Street goes to the rivers. That's Philadelphia. That is the city of Philadelphia. The city of Philadelphia is nested within the county of Philadelphia and is surrounded by a bunch of independent municipalities. Southwark, Moyamensing, Spring Garden, etc. Because of the persistent violence, in 1854, the General Assembly combines the city and county of Philadelphia. And so you go from that teeny tiny little sliver that is now Center City to a 140 square mile behemoth. And if you thought policing and governing that little chunk was tough, imagine governing a city the size of a county. Even today, most cities in the United States are not the size of counties. Pittsburgh is a city in the Allegheny County. The only one that I can think of off the top of my head is Los Angeles. The city of Los Angeles is coterminous with the county of Los Angeles, right? And think about how difficult governing that is. And that's 170 years later. This creates a number of challenges. And of course, it's smack dab in the middle of the great crucible of the American experiment, the Civil War. And the Civil War is very interesting in the city of Philadelphia because it does something totally unexpected. If you could get into a time machine and go to 1859, you would have absolutely no idea that Philadelphia would perform as much on behalf of saving the Union as it does. Because there were a lot of racist, pro-Southern people. And basically what happens is the Civil War is a crucible that strips most of that out of the city. It fundamentally alters the city government. It leads to the creation of a Republican political machine that controls the city for the next 8 years, or eight decades. I mean, it fundamentally reorients the political, economic, and cultural character of the city of Philadelphia. And Philadelphia plays an incredibly important role in the war as a recruiting station, as a fundraising station. The Great Sanitary Fair of 1864 was a massive fundraising operation. The largest of them was here in Philadelphia. It raised more than $1 million. President Lincoln himself came to the fair and auctioned off hand-signed copies of the Emancipation Proclamation. The Union League of Philadelphia owns one of them if you're curious about seeing it. But you would have had no idea about that in 1859 and 1860. Philadelphia was a profoundly democratic city with strong pro-Southern leanings. That's what it is when it goes into the war. It comes out of the war a rock-ribbed Republican city. And I detail the reasons why in the book, if you're particularly interested, but there is something else I want to talk about. And that is this. So one of the things that I say about the war is that if war is politics by other means, then the dozen years after the war is war by political means. The war answers only a single question raised by the war, and that is, are we going to allow slavery? The war definitively answers that question, no. It tells us nothing about the role that black people are going to play in the U.S. Are they going to be socially equal? Are they going to be politically equal? What about all of the women who became radicalized by the abolitionist movement and are now demanding equal rights? Are we going to give women suffrage? How is that going to work? Are we going to give white women suffrage but deny it to black women? All of these questions. Oh, and by the way, the South is pissed because we have burned it to the ground. Not enough, I would argue, but they're still pretty unhappy. So there are all these questions that are raised by the war. Abraham Lincoln, in the most exquisite timing of any politician ever, wins the war and immediately catches a nasty case of death. So he does not, I said that at the Union League, standing under a a life-size statue of Abraham Lincoln, and people visibly gasped. I think they were afraid the statue was going to fall over me. And you know what I say about that? Lincoln had a great sense of humor, and he would have laughed at that joke. You would have heard him laughing in the background like the donkey from Shrek. He would have loved it. So that is my defense. Ketch is a nasty case of death, doesn't have to answer these questions. And so we go through a prolonged period following the war where we're trying to figure out what does the future look like. And as we got close to 1876, which was the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, there was a sense that this national birthday could be an opportunity for binding up those wounds and answering some of those questions. And what we really needed to do was throw a massive rager so everyone could celebrate. And of course, Philadelphia was the logical place to do that. It wasn't the only place that was under consideration, but it was the logical place to do it. And in fact, in 1876, for several months, Fairmount Park was literally transformed into a small city in celebration of the Declaration of Independence. Now, we say in celebration of the Declaration of Independence. It was really a celebration of industry and culture. How many of you have been to Epcot Center? Yeah, the land of tomorrow, right? We're going to see all this technology, we're going to live on the moon, all that stuff. That was this. This was the first World's Fair in North America. And it was designed not so much as a celebration of the past, but as a look to the future. Powered by building-sized steam engines, which provided electricity. Trains came in, and it was like Disneyland. You could stay in the park, check into your hotel, eat at the restaurants. You never had to leave. You could just spend weeks checking this all out. And hundreds of thousands of people came to see this. States sent delegations, and they had little buildings to show off their houses. It was like a county fair, but on steroids. Countries sent delegations and exhibits. Like, here's a little Swedish family, right? Here's a little Austrian family. You could go see that. You could literally see the world here in Philadelphia. It was opened by President Ulysses S. Grant, who was accompanied by the King of Portugal on the day that he opened it. Now, I want to give you some sense of the scale of this. How many of you have been to the Please Touch Museum, which is currently in Memorial Hall? It's a pretty big building, right? I mean, it's a massive building. That is Memorial Hall. Yeah. The rest of it is even larger. And if you walk through Fairmount Park today, almost none of it exists. They tore almost all of it down. The Ohio building still exists. Some of the buildings were repurposed, but a lot of them were just torn down. Fairmount Park doesn't look anything like this anymore. But it's astonishing how for several months the eyes of the world turned to Philadelphia. And what's even more interesting is this was a very forward-looking event, but it creates a wave of nostalgia because it brings tourists to Philadelphia and encourages people to monetize the hell out of the city's history. So if you ever go on eBay and you're ever curious, just type in 1876 Centennial and you will see knickknacks like a glass slipper for Liberty and a banner for George Washington and these pressed wood coins that depict different eras in American history. I mean, it was a very backward-looking element too. The canard about Betsy Ross sewing the American flag. Her descendants owned a building in Center City and started that rumor and then monetized it. They were like, oh, see where Betsy Ross sewed the flag. And 150 years later, we're still selling that nonsense. It all starts here. Yeah. I don't think they're getting any royalties on it anymore. But it also leads to a spike in interest in family history and in antiquarianism. If you go to your local county historical society and you pick up those big, thick, library-bound books on the history of the county, history of Montgomery County, history of whatever, I guarantee you most of them were published between 1876 and 1900. Because this spurs the interest in that. Local historical societies get founded. The Historical Society of Pennsylvania, founded in 1884. In response to this. There are other historical societies that pop up, largely as a result of this wave of nostalgia that gets kicked off. And in many ways, Philadelphia, which had been the Athens of America, the bleeding edge of the future, in many ways begins turning around and looking at the past, and in part of that's because there's money to be made doing it. People want to see these sites. People want to be connected to Independence Hall and Betsy Ross and all that stuff.
Sir,
Yes,
on the right, it looks like a steel mill in those buildings.
yes.
That was all display buildings, that was all...
Yeah, so they had display factories, they had steam engines that were the size of buildings providing electricity, all that kind of good stuff. All right, so we have this Republican machine that's in control of the city, and as I suggested to you earlier, cities are always the targets of reform. And in the late part of the 19th century, we enter a period known as the Gilded Age, so-called for the title of a novel by Mark Twain, which none of you have ever read. It's not one of his better ones. But the best way I can describe gilding, when I was 16, I was dating a girl in high school, and I had a job, and I was like, I'm going to go to Clover and get this girl a ring. And I did. I bought a beautiful sterling silver ring, and I gave it to her, and for a week, I was the greatest guy in the world. And then around day 8, she was like, you were the biggest jerk in the world. Why is that? Go ahead. What happened?
The silvers came off.
And then what happened?
Turned her finger green.
Yep! It turned her finger green because that's gilding. Gilding is crap covered by a very thin layer of something precious. And that's the Gilded Age. Everything looks modern and cool and interesting, but down below is all this corruption. And you have a whole generation of journalists who do nothing but expose the seamy underside. The best known of them is Lincoln Steffens, who writes, all our municipal governments are more or less bad. Philadelphia is simply the most corrupt and the most contented. We're number 1. I think Lincoln Steffens was being unfair. He certainly didn't go out to rural America and see if there was any corruption out there. He wasn't hanging out on the main line and asking, is the government of Bryn Mawr run totally on the up and up? No. And it wasn't. It was owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad, so yeah. It again reminds you that Americans hate cities. But Lincoln Steffens writes this, and of course, corrupt and contented becomes like the go-to description of Philadelphia in this period. Even in the 19th century, Philadelphians, like the minute Donald Trump said bad things happen in Philadelphia, there were shirts on Etsy with people rocking that. If Etsy had existed in this period, people would have been rocking that. So, this becomes sort of the description of the city. And look, the Republican machine was corrupt as hell, but it was not any more corrupt than any other machine government is apt to be. And it was certainly fulfilling a long history of bad municipal services in the city. What ends up killing that is the New Deal. The New Deal fundamentally alters the structure and nature of American politics, and does that because the Republicans simply do not have any kind of answer to the Great Depression. And so as a result, the Democrats fill the void, and at the federal, Commonwealth, and city level really kind of take over. And you get the turbocharging of federal dollars coming into the city. And that, more than anything else, fundamentally alters Philadelphia's ability to provide municipal services. The New Deal also creates the middle class, and it does it through a variety of different means, one of which is the federal government insuring mortgages. Up to this point, if you could get a mortgage, it was for a very short term. A lot of times it was interest only, which means at the end of the loan you still owned the entire loan back. You weren't building any equity. When the federal government starts insuring loans, it means that banks are much more willing to make loans over longer periods of time and with affordable payments. And so people all of a sudden are able to buy houses. Now, I will give you a truism about Democrats. Are you ready? You want to understand Democrats? Democrats are absolutely scared to death of being called socialists or of one person benefiting from a program that they don't deserve. There could be 999,999 people benefiting from the program who are absolutely deserving. Democrats will throw those people under the bus to keep that one person out of benefiting. Because they know somebody like Ronald Reagan's going to lie about it. And that has been Democrats the entire time, since the New Deal. And I will prove that with this map. So there is a block of... So, the federal government is not actually going to loan money. It's not actually going to insure mortgages. That would be the most effective way to do it, wouldn't it? We're going to loan you money at 2% interest. We know where you live because we're the federal government. We can come take your assets. No. They come up with this uber complicated thing. We'll tell the banks, but the banks have to establish criteria, blah, blah, blah. By the way, they do the same stupid ass thing with student loans, which is ridiculous. If you've ever been to London, they have banks in the post office. We could do that. There is a better world possible. We don't do that because we're Americans, and Democrats are absolutely 100% scared of the ghost of Ronald Reagan lying about eligibility for these programs. So, you have that in the background. You also have, you see, you stop laughing in the second half of the program when I start spitting truth about Democrats and Republicans. The government says we're not going to loan the money directly, we're going to let the banks do that. And we're also going to create this quasi-government organization called the Homeowners Loan Corporation to run the program. So there's this other level. And it's not quite a government thing, and it's not quite a private thing. It's kind of like the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and all that nonsense. And they come up with loans to guide decision making. Now, the thing you got to know about Democrats is there's also a significant block of Southern racists in the Democratic Party at this time, and they are going to make damn sure that no black person is going to benefit from any of these programs. They're not going to benefit from the GI Bill, they're not going to benefit from homeowners insurance, they're not going to benefit from any of it. And if we have to throw 999,999 white people under the bus to prevent black people from benefiting, we will absolutely do that. And that's where you get redlining. So the government or the Homeowners Loan Corporation creates these maps, and it says, okay, you should give loans in places where they're green, you should maybe do some due diligence with blue, you should absolutely positively not give any loans in red. What do you want to guess about the racial composition of the red areas of the city?
Black.
Yes! And so as a result, you exclude a large percentage of black people from the single most important opportunity to create generational wealth ever. And as a result, you create ghettos, where these portions are getting wealthier and these portions are getting poorer, and as a result, they get blacker over time. And if you overlay a map of the city today, you would find that a lot of this still exists, a lot of these pockets of poverty. And it's entirely based on two decisions that get made at the highest levels. One is, we're not going to directly loan people money at low interest rates. We're going to get the banks involved. And two, we are going to create policies that are absolutely designed to exclude black people from this. And that's the reason why you have a large group of white ethnic people that over the course of the 20th century enter the middle class, and you keep most black people out of it. It didn't just happen that way. All right. So the New Deal fundamentally transforms the city for both good and ill. But then, of course, we have World War I. And World War II. And World War II is this massive, earth-shattering event, changes the world in a variety of different ways. I could do a semester-long course on how that all works. I'm not going to do that. What I am going to suggest is the United States and the Allies win World War II, and then you demobilize the Army and the Navy and the Marine Corps and all that stuff. And you've got millions of people coming back to the United States from Europe and Asia. And they have money in their pocket because the federal government's been paying them, because they've been serving in the Army, they want to start families. Many of the women have money in their pockets because they've been working, and there was nothing to spend money on because what was happening during the war, all the resources were going overseas. There was no aluminum, there was no rubber, there was no food, there was no nothing. So what are you going to do other than save money? Well, if there was no aluminum or metal or any of that stuff to buy fun stuff, was there any to, like, redo your house? Was there any to put a new roof on your house? No. So you've got 5 years of deferred maintenance. Oh, and before that it was a depression. Was anyone putting a new roof on their house during the Depression? Was anyone painting their house during the Depression? Was anyone doing any of that stuff?
No.
No. What does your house look like after 15 years of deferred maintenance? Exactly. The housing stock in this country is awful. And so both Republicans and Democrats are like, geez, we got all these millions of people. They're going to want to come back and do some baby making. And we don't have anywhere for them to live. What are we going to do? And so they're like, you know what? We should renew the cities. We should do urban renewal, right? Here's the secret of urban renewal. We're going to take all of that crappy housing stock from you using eminent domain. We are going to pay you less than market rate for it. We are going to sell it to developers, again, below market. They are going to fix it up. They're going to build new houses, and then they are going to sell it at market rate. Is that great for the developers? Yeah. Is that great for you? No, it's not. Would that piss you off? Okay, so we got a manufacture consent. And that is what happens in the 1940s. You have a massive campaign to manufacture consent for this. And in Philadelphia, that is spearheaded by an organization known as the Greater Philadelphia Movement, which hosts this really cool exhibit at Gimbel's, envisioning the future of Philadelphia. And this is just one element of it, but you can see the city, and it's got this transforming table that periodically would flip, and it's like, look at how terrible things are, and look at how cool things would be if you just let us use eminent domain to seize your house. And look at how bad it is, and we must get rid of neighborhood nuisances for new housing. Neighborhood nuisances like your house. And it works! People line up and get behind this. It is a massive giveaway to developers, but people line up for it. It's great. Thing is, urban renewal. Not suburban renewal, not rural renewal. This is taking the cities and making them less like cities. Does that look like urban living to you? Doesn't look like any city I've ever been in. Certainly doesn't look like Philadelphia. That looks like the suburbs. And so again, urban renewal has this very anti-urban flavor to it. But this becomes the zeitgeist of the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. And this is where you get guys like Edmund Bacon trying to re-engineer the city and, re-envisage Society Hill and doing all that fun stuff. And all of it is funded by federal dollars. And it has a tangible impact on the living patterns of the city. In 1942, in what is now called Center City, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 wards. Wards are political subdivisions of a place, and they are based entirely on population. The greater the population in a space, the more wards you're going to have. Make sense? We've got 6 in Center City, we've got 2 in the Northeast. All of a sudden we do urban renewal and federal highway subsidies and subsidized mortgages, and what do you end up with? In Center City you've got 1, 2, 3, 4. This is actually more than Center City. Wards, and you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 in the Northeast. We fundamentally alter the structure of living in the city over the span of a 25-year period, just through decisions that get made and where our funding priorities are. We dump a whole bunch of money into highways to make it possible to get out to the Northeast. We dump a whole bunch of money into building suburban-style housing out in the Northeast. And we are seizing houses down here versus urban renewal and building, different types of houses that are designed to create lower population density. And it fundamentally alters the structure of the city. And it does so in your lifetimes. If you were born in 1942, in 1965 you would have just graduated college. You would have been just out of college. In that very small period of time, it's fundamentally altered the way that we live in cities. Make sense? All right. So again, all of that is funded through federal government dollars. And of course, it leaves black people out. And not incidentally. That is not a mistake. That is absolutely the goal. And so as a result, you have the organization of the Civil Rights Movement. Now we tend to think of the Civil Rights Movement as a Southern phenomenon. But it plays an incredibly important role here in the North as well. And the leader of the Civil Rights Movement in Philadelphia is Cecil B. Moore. How many of you are Temple grads? All right. What is the bottom boundary of Temple's campus on the west side?
I went to Ambler.
Okay, so Cecil B. Moore Road is the very bottom portion of the campus because he was a Temple Law grad who became a civil rights attorney using the GI Bill. He certainly wasn't getting into Penn because Penn did not admit people who looked like Cecil B. Moore in that period. But this, of course, provokes a backlash. And that backlash has a face and a name. And in the late 1960s and early 1970s, it's Frank Rizzo. And he didn't invent police brutality, but he certainly perfected it. It's no surprise one of the most iconic images of him is a nightstick in his cummerbund. Frank Rizzo never met a skull he didn't want to crack. Am I wrong? Anyone want to defend Frank Rizzo as not a brutal piece of human garbage? I mean, come on. All right, so, but what makes all of this go is federal money, and that dries up in the 1970s. Many of you probably remember when New York declared bankruptcy in 1975, and there was a great New York Daily News headline, Ford the city drop dead. The Ford administration says we are not going to bail this city out. And that is across the board. Republicans begin cutting federal funding that continues to a certain extent through the Carter administration, but really picks up steam in the 1980s with the Reagan administration. And Philadelphia is heavily featured in movies of the time, but the depiction of the city is awful, right? I mean, you've all seen Rocky, right? The man runs like 150 miles, and I think at one point he ends up in Bucks County. And every single scene makes the city look awful, right? You've seen Trading Places. Eddie Murphy plays a homeless guy living in Rittenhouse Square. Like, what? Are you serious? But that's where they pick him up, in Rittenhouse Square. And the whole thing of the movie is that, like, you know, Dan Aykroyd, who's this wealthy mainline guy, one minute is living with a hooker in squalor in the next minute. Like, if you don't live on the main line, everything looks awful. But my absolute favorite is Witness, because it so totally sums up everything you need to know about Philadelphia in this period. You all remember Witness, right? Yeah. Cute little Amish boy comes into the city, goes to 30th Street Station, walks over like 3 junkies on the way into the bathroom, and then here's a murder in the stall, as you do. As that happens every day at 30th Street Station, right? There are murders upon murders all the time, right? Okay, he hears this murder. He and his mother flee and they go to the police and they meet Officer Han Solo, who's like, I don't know, those Philadelphia people get killed, what are you gonna do? But because his soul hasn't totally been destroyed by living in Philadelphia, he's like, I'll take on the case. And what happens? He ends up getting shot. So what do? They flee to Lancaster. Because of course you go to rural America to heal physically and, let's be honest, spiritually. You go live among the Amish in this simple way of life where you're raising barns and canning fruit and trying to sleep with Kelly McGillis, right? That's how you heal your soul. And he almost wants to stay out there, except the city just can't let him go. The murderer comes out looking for him. And when you get to the end of the movie, the real kick in the pants is, who's the murderer? A black cop! Of course it is! It's every racist trope married to everything, every corrupt, oh my God, you can't trust the city government, oh my God, everything is awful and gritty and terrible, right? And ultimately, Officer Han Solo ends up shooting first and killing him. That's a Star Wars joke. And but he's so broken inside because he spent too much time in the city that he's got to go back. He can't stay with Kelly McGillis. I mean, think about the messages about the city, about American culture, all embedded into that. And you can see almost all of the themes that I've unpacked in the book. And this is the background to the last book that was published in 1982. This movie comes out in 1984. This is what Philadelphia was like. But even with that sense of that horrible grittiness, Philadelphia is nevertheless a place that people want to be associated with. Our deep bench of revolutionary and constitutional history makes us a go-to prop for politicians. I mean, in 2000, when the Republicans wanted to talk about a kinder, gentler conservatism, and they hauled George Bush up and gave him a monosyllabic speech to read, where do they do it? Here in Philadelphia. When Barack Obama's campaign in 2008 was on the ropes and he needed to make a crucial speech about race, he did it at the Constitution Center. And when in the last election cycle, the two candidates met in their only debate, they did it in a broom closet at the National Constitution Center, didn't they? Because Philadelphia still has that symbolic value, even as, of course, it continues to deal with the racist and, I would say, anti-urban vision that many people had and continue to have. And with that, I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you all very much for your time and attention.
Unfortunately, we only have time for one question because we are closing in 15 minutes. So,
I promise the answers will be short.
okay, good question. Go ahead, someone.
Yeah.
How do you feel about what they do at the Eastern State Penitentiary every Halloween? Being a historian and being someone who worked there.
That is a very complicated issue. I will tell you that they wouldn't be in operation if they didn't do it. When I was there, it was much more about leveraging its past as a prison, which was kind of icky. And when Pennhurst opened, there was a sustained discussion about whether or not sites of human suffering, like mental hospitals, like homes for the mentally handicapped, and like prisons, should leverage those things and exploit them for the past, or for money. It's interesting, they rebranded it several years ago, and I went this year for the first time in many, many years, and almost none of the Halloween stuff made any reference to it being a prison, which was, I think, their attempt to get away from it. Look, I work in the museum industry. There are a lot of things that we do that are not necessarily directly mission aligned, but are there to make money so that we can do mission aligned stuff. So I have a fairly flexible sense of that stuff. I don't like it when you are leveraging human suffering for making money. So for instance, I don't think forced labor camps or plantations should offer weddings. I think that's icky. I don't think the prison should offer Halloween-based horror scares that are built around exploiting what we think of what goes on in prisons. I think that's icky. But, they gotta make a buck. I'll answer a couple other questions.
What do you think about the proposed Sixers arena in China?
Oh, Jesus Christ. Look, at the end of the day, I think municipalities are like Charlie Brown with the football when it comes to sports arenas. They always allow themselves to believe that they're going to make money. They never make any money, and they end up whoring themselves to these organizations that are extremely extractive. If the Sixers were good, I might even be willing to entertain that discussion, but they're not! They're awful! And if you read Jane Jacobs, she talks about building these institutions in the middle of cities that are mono-purposed, right? They have one purpose, and the rest of the time they're dark. And that is destructive to the fabric of a city, particularly when you're talking about a neighborhood that's got businesses and living establishments and other kinds of things. So I wish the Sixers would move to Jersey or to the moon. Other questions? I'll do dynamite answers real fast.
Yeah, we have to wrap it up, sorry.
Oh, all right. Well, my website is www.paulkahan.com. Please feel free to reach out to me. I'm selling copies of the book. I can take cash. I can take checks. If you really press me, I can take Venmo. $40 a copy. I'm happy to autograph them. Don't miss out. You've got 10 minutes. Everybody go home.